Welcome to Technomics, a podcast that explores the intersection of technology and the economy. Hosted by Robyn and Jeremy Nelson, Technomics is brought to you by Insight. The host's opinions, while mostly brilliant, are their own.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Technomics. I'm Robyn your host, along with my co-host,
Jeremy Nelson.
And our special guest today is Russell Temple.
Hi, thank you.
Russ, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I am a 10-year veteran here at Insight. I actually started off doing billable consulting work for Insight around Microsoft and virtualization technologies. And since then, I have grown through the ranks to take ownership of the data center practice, where I have line of business responsibility for all the services we provide to customers around data center technologies.
And data center is why we're here today. That's why you're listening to an episode we are now lovingly calling the software-defined coffee maker. Because it is a look into the hopeful future of possibilities for data center and more specifically, the software-defined aspect of it. So I guess as a more of a basic question, what are we really talking about when we apply the term software-defined?
So when we look at the data center in the traditional aspects, you have three main services that you're providing to customers coming out of the data center. You have compute services, storage services, and network services. And what has changed over, I would say, the last 5 or 6 years is the ever-presence of virtualization. So when we think about operating systems, we tend to traditionally think about an operating system that runs a single device, like a laptop, a server, a mobile device in that regard. The thing that's interesting right now is that virtualization has become so prominent in the data center. You're starting to see this evolution of a single operating system for running an entire data center. So when we look at the context of the services around compute, network, and storage, and using virtualization to virtualize all three of those traditional aspects of a data center, you start to have this software-defined component to it.
And the interesting piece about that is that, so lots of people look at that and they think, well, you've got people who run networks. You have guys who manage compute. You have guys who manage storage. What are what would you say are some of the primary drivers around the centralized operating system and software-defined infrastructure?
Efficiencies. So like you just pointed out, you had a very good point of people who do network, people who do compute, people who do storage. And when you get into this context of a software-defined ecosystem around the traditional services, you start to see the efficiencies of having software run everything versus having someone traditionally do manual tasks like adding an operating system to a server, provisioning storage through an interface by someone else. When you let software run everything, you go through a single interface, a single management console that gives you a complete view of your data center and allows applications to fluidly expand and contract what they need from a traditional infrastructure standpoint with operational management, and then allowing the individuals who used to do the siloed approach to IT an evolutionary aspect of their skill sets. So no longer will you have a compute person, networking person. You see a culmination of skill sets horizontally, but then you see a new aspect around things like capacity management, operational efficiencies, and then we start to look at cloud computing and how that breaks into it.
So there's a tremendous benefit of scale here.
Yes.
So how does that translate from a business outcome perspective? If you suddenly have the IT functions in your organization moving to this more horizontal, holistic approach to human resources, what, besides obviously being able to scale up and down, which is better, in a more is better kind of philosophy, where are some of the actual outcomes?
It goes back to us telling IT for a number of years, do more with less. And that's also from a financial standpoint, also from a human resources personnel standpoint. When you can actually free up resources to be more innovative and strategic to the business as a whole, instead of doing traditional mundane tasks like racking and stacking, operating system implementation, you start to actually elevate the level of interaction that IT has with the business, being in terms of being more innovative to drive business outcomes and IT outcomes.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Like you talk about the rack and stack and things like that, and lots of times you hear people who are afraid, right? It generates some fear in organizations where traditionally they've had those tiered levels of IT services. in your experience out there, have you seen people who embrace it as an empowerment of their existing workforce, or is it still very much existing IT kind of push against it because they're afraid of what that means for them in their future?
It's change, right? Some people like change, some people adopt to change, and some people have a very large fear of change. If we look back to how voice over IP took over the telecommunications industry, there were some who thought that that was just a fad, it wasn't going to last, and they decided to not evolve their skill sets with it, and they faded out in terms of capabilities. Then we had those who actually evolved themselves and went with it. Same pattern in this scenario as well. Again, you're letting software control a traditional aspect in the service that we've had from a physical aspect. With this context, though, what you're starting to see is it's less about the fear of the individual and it's more about the fear of how do I have to restructure my IT organization to take into account of that? What are the skill gaps? And that's where a CIO typically looks at it and goes, I want to drive these efficiencies. I want to get these cost efficiencies. I want to be more innovative, but I know I have a challenge from a skill gap perspective. And traditionally, IT was built as a reactive organization, right? You have a ticketing system, you put it in, IT takes it, it goes to the right individual, they close the case, and that's a reactive nature of IT. To become proactive, you have to get out of that traditional ticket system, siloed approach of IT, and that's really where a lot of the challenge is. Technology is fairly easy. It's really around business process, organizational alignment, and then skill set gap.
And at the heart, it really boils down to that kind of challenge that IT organizations have had for 30 years now, is that viewing IT instead of as a cost center, as a business partner or a business enabler, right?
Yes, and I'm glad you didn't use profit center because that's I think that's the evolutionary goal. I think there's baby steps in between, so I think you hit it well on the head that you've got to get to the partnership level before you can jump into that profit center piece.
Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, from the marketing perspective, that's really where we're at, right? I mean, we've gone from a cost center to rapidly moving towards a revenue marketing model because of technology, right? We've gone through the motion of building out the right team alignment, getting the right skill set, and getting the right technological tools in place. So it sounds like this is another way technology is disrupting the business. It's just coming home to IT.
Sounds like you're running software-defined marketing.
Oh, yeah, actually, and it's done all in the cloud, too, by the way.
Absolutely.
I want to ask, though, so there's obviously like the personnel and operational aspect to moving to the software-defined data center, but what are the other steps that are out in front of it? I mean, have we really completed the emerging data virtualization phase that needs to happen, or what would you need to think about if you want to move to that kind of scaling in the data center?
In the data virtualization phase, that's an interesting question because when we look at it from the big data standpoint, big data tools exist all over the place. There's a plethora that you can choose from. But again, similarly in the software-defined data center context, the software really is the easy part. It's what you want it to do and what you want to get out of it that you get the biggest bang for the buck. So when we look at big data, this is why we see a lot of the leadership and thought leadership around big data coming from things like the chief marketing officer or marketing organizations, because they're looking for trends, they're looking for analysis to become more effective to their end user population and their account base. So while big data is a very big push from a technology perspective, there really is a tremendous amount of importance around marketing, what you want to get out of it for it to drive value.
I appreciate that endorsement.
Of course.
No, but it is something that we think about a lot, right? I mean, as any part of a business is looking at how to become more profitable in terms of what they either bring to the business or the value they bring to the business. I think data is a really important factor. That's how we understand our effectiveness, and being able to operationalize that, store it, be able to access it. All of those things are incredibly pertinent to anybody's day job at this point. I guess the next question I have is how does software definition put an emphasis? I don't know what this question is. Jeremy, you go.
Oh, was I supposed to? Oh,
yeah.
You wanted me to take a question?
There you go. Toss to you.
Okay. One of the big questions that, we always run into, right? So as an organization who's very focused on trying to drive software-defined drive solutions, help enable our partners, what types of organizations are we seeing it? Is it only large organizations? Is this only an enterprise thing right now? Is this a provider solution right now, or who's really ready, or who is software defined really positioned for?
No, it's a great question. We see it primarily in probably what I would categorize as small, medium enterprise, and then going up. So commercial and going up into the higher tiers. Definitely in the service provider area. Anything that they can do to help with software management, rapid provisioning, anything to that degree helps them become more cost effective. The thing that's a challenge right now from the cost perspective is that you have two sets of paths you could go down from the software defined context. You have the open platform and you have the proprietary platform. Right now, there isn't an actual, in my opinion, a leader just yet that's really come to the forefront that says that I have everything baked. There are costs associated with each one. Anytime you go down the open piece, open sounds great, it's free, but there is the fact that there is a support aspect to it. So organizations look at open platforms and go, that's where we got to drive to, that's where I have to go. I do not realize that at times that I have to actually exponentially grow my existing IT organization to support that, because then I become the owner of that.
Yeah, and there's a certain philosophy around open, right? Is that you're not just a consumer, you're an active participant.
Yes.
Right? Is that I mean, that's how open source really started, is that as a business who adopts this technology, we don't expect you to just take, we very much expect you to invest in the platform and potentially even bring developers in who will not only support you, but will continue to grow the product as a whole.
Absolutely. I mean, the contribution aspect of open source is what has always been so attractive for a lot of people. And when you look at it from an internal IT perspective, it's one thing to be able to use an open platform in your IT organization, but there is an expectation from the community that you'll take your lessons learned and share that back to the community. So, there's a give and take there. On the proprietary platform side, a lot of these tools that come out of the box are built with software support into them. You can call an IT or a support organization to get help. Services organizations are typically more in tune towards a proprietary side, but are growing towards the open side. I would say, realistically, you're probably, I've heard anywhere from 2 quarters. I think that's a tad bit aggressive, but I think you're probably about a good 4 quarters out before open is really there to take the forefront of that piece. So you're probably going to see a blend of both open and proprietary platforms in the IT organization.
If you think about how technology is becoming the secret sauce of so many different types of organizations, how does that potentially present a challenge to the development in the OpenStack piece of this? If somebody does get through a collaboration on their internal IT side with an OpenStack approach and they go, this is good, but we can't tell anybody because it's our competitive advantage.
It's talent. Because the first time that someone talks about it or blogs about it or tweets about what they did in their internal community at that point, someone's going to take notice of that and say, well, I want you to come over and do that for my organization as well. So talent retention will be probably the largest thing that IT organizations have to fear when they look at going down open platforms.
I mean, I've seen that in some of the organizations that I've worked before, is that, and it kind of ties back to, like you were saying, Russell, before, is that really the heavy adopters of software defined is that, kind of medium enterprise space, because it comes back to, obviously, they're running at a different scale than your large enterprises who can continue to justify the costs associated with very large scale IT organizations. So, the more medium-sized business are looking to streamline, and so they're also usually looking at other cost savings. And so, those open platforms become very, very attractive, right? Because the price to enter is very low. And, I worked for, an organization of that size, and when they definitely embraced the open technology. But then we had, like you mentioned, some some key individuals leave. And we then found that, documentation wasn't maintained properly. There wasn't a lot of cross-discipline training or knowledge share going on. And so when those individuals left, there was a very large void in the ability to continue to run and support the environment. And then, that's just keeping the lights on.
Right.
Forget growing.
Right.
Forget going to the next step. So yeah, that continues. That's been a risk for a while with open platforms.
Absolutely.
And just like you said, will probably continue to be one.
So who are the key players in this arena of either OpenStack or software defined right now? I guess maybe reframe the question to say, who is leading the conversation on agile data centers? Right? That's really the mission, right? Is to make it more agile for the entire organization.
So there's kind of two ways to look at the agile data center, and you look at it from the traditional technology aspect, or you look at it from the actual physical data center itself. One of the things that I think that software-defined data center, in terms of a context, misses out on, is some kind of a data center infrastructure management tool that basically says, you know, look, you have hot aisle, cold aisles, you have infrastructure spread out. When you get to an efficient standpoint, you will have a reduction of infrastructure, which means you'll have a reduced footprint in your data center, and it means you have an unutilized asset that you're paying for. DCIM tools in conjunction with software defined, I think, is one of the gaps that has to come into play here pretty quickly. The leaders right now that keep coming up and pushing this forefront are, obviously OpenStack with Red Hat, VMware with their software-defined data center products like vRealize, obviously Microsoft with Azure from the clouds aspect coming back into the data center.
Is it Azure or Azure?
I don't know.
This is a really important topic. We're going to take some time to discuss it because I hear it both ways, and it seems like whenever I'm having a conversation about it, somebody is looking at me like, did you really just say it like that?
All right, I'm going to go with Azure because it's the blue Azure sky.
Yes.
And it's all about clouds.
Yes.
My vote is on Azure.
But Azure sounds so
It's
fancy.
very fancy. I will give that.
I don't know. I just have called it Azure all this time.
We'll have to bring in somebody from Microsoft to give us a definitive answer.
Good Microsoft speak.
I'm glad we addressed that. That might be the most important thing that we've said today, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is
There we go.
OpenStack, software-defined, Azure.
At least we got the big topics covered.
I think
Yes.
so. We try and strive for 3 solid topics in a podcast. I think we nailed it.
I like your definition though about the blue cloud, the blue sky and the clouds. Yeah,
That's at
good.
least where my brain went.
Are you sure you're not in marketing?
Oh, I'm 100% sure.
All right, so I think that, really to sum it all up here, the premise of these conversations is that everyone's kind of coming to the realization, like, you're not going to make money with your hardware, but you have to optimize the hardware that you have. Mm-hmm. That seems to be the nucleus of a lot of these initiatives. So if you move away from hardware entirely as, a small to medium business, which would very realistically do and certainly is evidenced by the boom in service provider business, where does that leave the enterprise?
You're going to look at how architecture has changed. So software-defined data center is a framework, it's an architecture, it's a journey at the end of the day. There are components that go into that, from software-defined compute, software-defined networking, but basically what you're essentially doing is going back to letting virtualization control everything from additional services, let software run it, but what does that mean from the hardware platform standpoint? When you look at applications today, a lot of the traditional services that you get in the storage platform, like replication, redundancy, deduplication, some of that is actually escalating into the application layer. So there really isn't a need to have potentially a storage array that does all that for you, depending on the complexity of the application. So at that point, all I need is software to run something that can hold disk at that point. So when you look at the high interest of hyper-converged infrastructure, so things like Nutanix and SimpliVity and SDDC Rail, Evo Rail from VMware, and amongst others, you're really looking at basically traditional rack mount servers with a bunch of disk in them and letting software sit on that. And then some of those traditional aspects that are built into the array and the storage system may sit in the application layer, don't need to sit at the hardware layer. So then you actually start to look at a lower cost of entry from a storage platform perspective. Networking, same thing. There's this, I would say, philosophical debate around software-defined networking. Is a compute platform faster than traditional silicon that you get from Cisco or an HP? And that's a hard one, right? That's a hard one to have the conversation around. At the end of the day, a software-defined network is not going to determine if you need a 40 gig network or a 10 gig network or a 100 gig network. That will still be in play. But a lot of IT organizations are going to start to question, well, if a lot of the services that I've typically been using are now in a software-defined context, don't I just need a simple box that can give me a 40 gig NIC or a 40 gig SFP, and I'll handle the software at a different layer?
I think it's interesting too, like you just mentioned, Russell, is that even if we look at the traditional providers of combination hardware software platforms, like Cisco is the first one that comes to mind, right? Cisco One, right? Mm-hmm. They're even literally saying, hey, we recognize that the software that we run within silicon is probably more valuable than the actual hardware itself. And so the ability to actually sell the story of one operating system, you subscribe to the operating system, and then as you need to swap out hardware to help you increase your capacities, right? Almost turning their model into our hardware is kind of dummy box. We'll continue to add performance to it, but really it's the software you care about. And that's what they're trying to, kind of separate and drive customers towards understanding. You continue to look at even the genericization, I think I just made up a word.
Congratulations.
Of hardware. For instance, like even if you look at like on the Juniper side, right, the QFX 5100, it's a switch where it's literally just generic components that runs a hypervisor that Junos then runs in.
Yep.
So you just see this evolution of that hardware space in, like you said, networking, which is, it seems almost impossible to think about decoupling software and hardware, but you're starting to see that evolution coming about.
And you start to see some evolution on the storage side with some storage platforms. So when you look at the biggest challenge when you have the software-defined infrastructure or a private cloud, it's kind of taken another name as we go through the evolution of it, you still have proprietary formats that these virtual machines and workloads all sit in. But Azure, that's a Microsoft platform that has a Microsoft format to it. So if you're a VMware shop today and you want to move to that, you have this process that you have to go to actually move the virtual machine into that environment by changing the format. So there is not a universal standard for that right now. And that's why the integration with private and public clouds is a journey, because some people don't have the time to build that migration strategy. So storage platforms are looking at saying, well, let me take that on for you. Let me take on that necessary technical aspect, get that out of your hands, and I'll run that for you. So you start to see some efficiency, some innovation starting to come into hardware platforms that may be going away from their traditional selling cycles and saying, how do I get customers into a hybrid cloud faster? Because that's where this is all going at the end of the day.
It makes me think two things. One, it's sort of like, there's always been, it's the age-old battle of Mac versus PC, right? Which is not really, are you a Mac person or are you a PC person? It's, are you an iOS person or are you a Windows person, right? It's a philosophy of operating systems. And, you alluded to the point, Jeremy, about Cisco acknowledging, certainly with some of the business moves they've made in the past year, that hardware isn't the most valuable service that we offer. The software it's running is where the real golden bars are. Secondly, as you're talking about moving towards a private cloud offering, and as you're talking about the efficiencies of, how many disks you need to rack and stack, right? Like how much space is required, my not as technical brain goes to, well, wow, that really changes the commercial real estate conversation.
It does.
Well, and the green conversation. Right?
Yeah.
Obviously that's important. We're all trying to kind of preserve the earth and, be responsible stewards of the resources that we've been given. And it's also just something where, along with the real estate, I loved it. One of my favorite, parts of that show is Silicon Valley. And I apologize. I know we've talked about this before.
You're like an evangelist for Silicon
I am.
Valley.
It's just such a great show.
Can I start dropping a lot of 30 Rock references, even though it's off the air?
That's another one of my top shows, so you're more than welcome.
All right.
I'll follow right along.
And I'll follow you on the Silicon
Shut
Valley.
it down.
Huge fan of that show.
Right?
Yes.
Wasn't that amazing? So one of my favorites is when he's negotiating for the name of Pied Piper, right? And he goes out and he's talking to this farmer, and this farmer is just, up in Northern California, you have the sprawl of technology, right? I mean, you see him with the protesters against the buses for the technology companies, that they're coming in and they're taking over that part of the earth, basically. And, they're looking out, and he's got this field that he's watering, and there's this huge data center out in the middle of nowhere. And, this farmer, an older gentleman, just kind of says, how much he hates it, that they're taking over, they're putting in these monstrosity buildings. And his whole philosophy was, well, my solution will decrease the need for facilities like that. And back to the same kind of thing. I see this as the same situation where, we reduce the need for so much data center sprawl.
And you actually hit on a really interesting point, because when we look at cloud providers and you get into this context of, if I'm a cloud provider, if I provide software as a service, platform as a service, do I colo? Do I own my own data center? What do I do with that? And when you look at like a Facebook who owns their data centers, but they do such revolutionary things from an environmental standpoint for their data centers to give back in terms of energy efficiencies, that actually creates a very interesting cost structure versus those who use colos, who use traditional data center physical infrastructure for cooling and powering. And that cost model starts to get a little bit weighed towards more efficient data centers who give back to the grid, who provide air back, the O2 back to the environment. And that's where you start to see a lot, I think, hype around, okay, if I'm going to be in the cloud, should I use a colo? Should I use my own data centers? And if you can actually control costs through actually owning your data center, but also giving back from a power grid perspective, using alternative fuels, alternative means of actually creating energy, you actually have a better control over the cost structure as a cloud provider at that point. So you can drive better margin.
It pays to be green.
It does, absolutely.
Green trees and azure skies.
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
There you go. See, we're rocking and rolling today.
Man,
I
this
love
Azure
this.
thing is just gold.
It is.
Actually, it's blue.
They're not even
Blue.
sponsoring this. That doesn't mean they won't be.
Yeah, I was going to say. I see someone's brain formulating something.
Marketing.
All right. Closing thoughts. Where do we think we're going to be in the conversation around software-defined data center 1 year from today?
I think we're going to be in an area where open and proprietary platforms hit an intersection. And there's going to be probably a hybrid of the two. Now, if you look at what VMware is doing, VMware actually has their own distribution of OpenStack. They call it VIO, VMware Integrated OpenStack. They see the path of where it's going. OpenStack, I mean, same thing. You have free open distributions, but then you have the paid for Red Hat distribution at the same time. I honestly think by 12 months from now, you're probably going to see some kind of an intersection or a hybrid version of an open and proprietary platform.
Jeremy?
For me, I see the next year as really an education point for most enterprises, right? Is that the message coming from their vendors and their partners around as they're looking at refresh cycles and things like that is going to be away from the traditional way of thinking. And I think it's going to be an awakening for a lot of our clients, is that they're going to be forced to look at software defined as opposed to being able to just kind of rinse and repeat like they've done for the past 20, 30 years. I think this is going to be a year where they're going to almost be hit in the face with having to embrace software defined at some level within their data centers.
I'm going to put an asterisk on my statement as well. Also, pay attention to where containers comes into play in this whole thing. Containers will could potentially have a huge impact on how the proprietary and the open platforms come together.
Yeah, there's a reason why they're getting as much focus as they are, right?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Closing statement. If you no longer need as much data center as you previously had because you've defined it with software, what do you do creatively? Have a little fun with this. What do you do with all of those racks?
So here's the great thing. Do I think there's going to be a cannibalization of infrastructure? I don't think there's going to be a cannibalization. I think there's going to be an evolution of it. I don't think the rack is going to go away. I think it's going to take on a new form that we're traditionally used to. We obviously have capacity management capabilities from a power standpoint in racks today, but I would see racks becoming more intelligent and more integrated into the hardware. So when we look at things in the journey perspective about self-healing applications and saying, okay, in a software-defined context, if I can tell if a rack is about to have an imminent failure because of a hardware, power, whatever, I can dynamically move applications to standby or potentially other capacity available in the data center. I think that's where the next evolution has to happen from a hardware perspective, is how it ties directly into a management platform for self-monitoring and self-healing. So I don't necessarily see hardware going away as much as it becomes more integrated.
I'm going to take it in a more whimsical direction. I would personally imagine that we'll see a lot of racks turned into either meat smokers or potentially beer fridges.
Even better.
I think that there are probably a lot of IT professionals running data centers who are going to start thinking about that right now. I was going to propose.
Remember the cooking device you should put on the engine block of your car?
Oh, I do.
So
I do
why
remember
not that for the data center, right? So to your point about the smoker, why
There
can't
you
I
go.
have some kind of a cooker right on top of the rack?
There
I
you
mean,
go.
IBM has Watson. I feel like there's going to be like a data center cookbook that comes out to accompany Chef Watson.
There
Oh
you
my
go.
goodness, those are hilarious. I've read through some of those, like drinks invented by Watson and dishes invented by Watson, and they are interesting.
All right. That's it for another episode. Our great thanks to Russell Temple for coming in and helping me, for one, learn a little more about software-defined data center. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Or
Thanks.
actually, I guess you'll hear us next time, right? The
Tune
end.
Thanks for listening. You can find all of our shows on iTunes. Join us next time for another episode of Technomics.